everyone, this is Mr. Marshall at Stony Lane. Math is such an important part of what our kids learn each and every day. But math is one of those things that has changed a whole lot since the time we were all kids. Because as a field, educators have learned so much more about the way kids learn math and what they need to do in order to really be successful. And so math looks different. Math looks different than when we were students. And so I wanted to take a few minutes of your time to talk to you about how we teach math and ways that you can support your child at home in how they learn math. Okay, so let's take a look. So there are what's called three dimensions of mathematics. Okay, there's three different major areas that we're always paying attention to when we teach math. The first is computation. Computation is the straight math fact work. It's the adding, subtracting, multiplying, and dividing that kids have to do in all sorts of different mathematical operations and processes. So computation is pretty important. Kids need to know their math facts so they can recall them quickly. That doesn't mean that we don't take our time to do that, and that doesn't mean that we don't understand the concept behind it, but we do also need to know our math facts so that we can use them. Okay. The second one is called numeracy, and sometimes we call that number sense. And numeracy is something that's sort of like invisible in math. It's the way kids understand what numbers mean, what the number 5 means when we see it as a 5, when we see it in 500, when we see it in a pentagon, when we see it in 1/5. It all means something different, even though it's the same symbol. Okay, but it just means something different. And so it's important for kids to understand that. And if we don't pay attention to numeracy, what happens is kids sometimes, like traditional times when we were children, many of us didn't get a lot of instruction in numeracy. And so what happens is kids do really well in elementary school and maybe even middle school, and then they get to algebra 1 and they get confused because they see 2x and x squared and they think it's the same thing because they see the same symbols. If they have a good background in numeracy, then they're better ready to understand that more abstract work when they get to high school. And finally, there's problem solving. Problem solving is the application of all the things that they learn in math and trying to relate them to real life situations. Okay, so these three things are done all at the same time with a sense of balance. It's almost like the guy in the circus that spins the plates, and he has to make sure all the plates continue spinning. Because you have to imagine that this is like having three math muscles in your mind. And if we pay more attention to one than the others, it can grow pretty big, but then the other two never really catch up. So it's important to teach these three with a sense of balance. We're teaching all of them all the time. Okay. So ways that you can help your child with computation, have them try to solve a problem with smaller numbers. So if they're doing their math homework and they need to compute and they're having a hard time with it, try replacing the big numbers with smaller ones and see if they understand the process of how the computation works. If they understand the process, then you know it's just the math facts they need to work on. If they don't understand the process, then it's the process you've got to work on. Build on what they know. So if your child is struggling with subtracting some numbers, but they're good at adding them, try flipping the problem and talking about it in terms of addition, and then flipping it back into subtraction. Because if you start with whatever a child knows in any learning situation, not just math, that can be the right door in to their learning. Work on recognizing patterns. Math is filled with patterns, and that's one of the most unique parts about it. And one of the most fun parts of it is when you can figure out the patterns behind the numbers. Like in this hundreds chart, there are lots of patterns in the way that the digits go, going up and down the columns or going even diagonally. You can see going diagonally, the tens column grows one and the ones column grows one. The tens column grows one and the ones column grows one. If you go this way, it's the opposite. Okay, so there's all sorts of different patterns in charts like this, or in the shapes around us, or in just about anything that's math. Helping kids with number sense, try to relate things to each other mathematically, because when we compare things, that's another example of how kids can build something new on something that they already know. Okay. Whenever you talk to your children about anything regarding math, think about how these things have a relationship with each other. Use mathematical language around the house, right? There's lots of math around us in the house, angles and weights and all sorts of different things. So it's good to throw in some of those mathematical terms that they're going to learn in school, like how many degrees an angle is, or how many pounds something weighs, or anything like that. Talking about mathematical processes, anything that's like math kind of vocabulary, if you can make it live in your house, then all of a sudden it becomes real. It becomes something that's bigger than just schoolwork, and that's something that can make things feel relevant, and then they'll learn it a little bit better. Draw a picture to represent mathematical concepts, because sometimes kids see something on paper, but they don't really understand what it means. But when they see what it can look like in a drawing or in a real life model, it becomes more real, and then they start to understand a little bit more. Tips to help kids with problem solving. So this is true for a word problem. Read the word problem and ask them what they know. What is the problem telling you? Because in word problems, or story problems, we call them sometimes, there's information that is given to you, all right? And it's usually based around the number. So if they're having a hard time identifying what they know inside the problem, if they look for the number and then read around the number, they can usually figure that out. Then they need to figure out what they don't know. Okay, what is the question asking inside this problem? And then think about, well, what kind of math work do I need to do? Is this something where I need to subtract or multiply or compare? What do I have to do? Sometimes I have to do more than one thing, and figuring out, like, for example, if something's about groups that have the same number of something inside, then that's always going to be a multiplication problem. Okay. I'm trying to figure out what are we supposed to do as a student of math. Draw a picture to represent mathematical concepts. Okay, it's the same thing as before. When we can make it a little more concrete, then kids will understand it better. Discuss the learning either orally or in writing afterwards. So when you're done, talk about how did you solve that, or if your child is big enough, have them write about how they solved it. Tell the math story behind their work. What were they thinking about? Because if they can articulate that, then they're probably going to more easily transfer it to a new learning situation later. Again, same thing. If they're trying to solve a problem and they're having a hard time, take the numbers and just replace them with smaller numbers and see if it works. And if they can figure it out with smaller numbers, then they can work on it with bigger numbers afterward, because then they've learned the process. There's another thing that's related to this, that sometimes we use numberless word problems. Okay, we set up a situation, but we don't include the numbers, and we just see if students know what mathematical process needs to be followed here. Is this an addition problem, or is this a division problem? What is it? So here are some other things to remember. In general, in math, whenever we're done solving a problem or creating something, a great thing to do is to represent your thinking in words, numbers, and pictures, because then students are kind of attacking it from many different angles, and they're making it very concrete, and they're thinking about their thinking. That's something that we call metacognition. They're thinking about how they solved something. And so it's not just about getting it right or wrong. It's not just about having the right numbers. It's a lot more three-dimensional than that. You see, three-dimensional, there's a number. You see what I did there? Okay. Talk about math using mathy and non-mathy words. So earlier we talked about integrating math vocabulary around your house, but also talking about what that means, right? What that means. So sometimes we might say something like, we're going to multiply, and that's a very mathy kind of word. But a non-mathy word for that is, well, we're thinking about how groups go together, how groups of equal number go together. And we're talking about that math concept in a not very math way, all right? That's another way to get kids to understand what's going on in their math. Notice math in your environment. Maybe in your house you have a really interesting looking picture frame that's a rectangle that's really long but not that wide. And just like talk about that. Talk about that with your kids and see, what thoughts they have about that. or let them help you with something in the kitchen when you're cooking or baking something, or when you're fixing something. See if you can get them involved in noticing the math in their house. If your child is doing well in math, we had a previous video about this. If your child is a second grader, don't push them into third grade math or fourth grade math, because sometimes they'll be able to do it, but they're not able to really necessarily deepen their understanding. Okay, and then later on they're going to fall apart. So instead, try to slow them down, keep them on the same grade level concept, but do different work with it. So one way to do that is to keep a tiny notebook. Sometimes we call it a teeny tiny notebook or a thinking notebook, where they just jot down stuff around their environment about math, and then you talk about it once they have a lot of different things in there. Also, to notice patterns. Like, there's nothing more powerful in math than noticing patterns of anything, of shapes, of numbers, or anything around us. Anytime you can bring a pattern into the conversation, you're making your child smarter in math. Math manipulatives, these are something that we use a lot in school. You may have seen these. They're not just toys, but since little children learn things better when they're concrete rather than abstract, we like to give our students different things like this, like these fraction pieces on the right here. Help kids really realize that a third and a fourth are not the same thing. It helps them realize that there's 6 1/6 pieces inside a whole, inside an entire circle. Okay, this down here with the triangles, that's called a geoboard. It's a pegboard with rubber bands that helps kids design geometric shapes and study them. There's counters. Then the thing here on the left, these are base 10 blocks. These are amazing at helping students understand place value, which is one of the most important concepts when trying to develop students' number sense or numeracy. Okay, and these are some examples of commercially bought manipulatives. Really, anything in your house that can help kids visualize or touch a mathematical concept is going to be a manipulative that helps them figure it all out. And if your child is having a problem with something in their math, create a manipulative at home. Okay, little kids sometimes count on their fingers and everything, and that's okay. But we want them to eventually get off of that and try to use other kinds of manipulatives. And we're not going to use manipulatives all our lives, but just while we're learning the concepts, it's really helpful for kids if they can use them so that they can learn those. Numbers are very abstract. So if you take a look at the number 2 or the number 4 and all of these different representations, they look very different, and kids have to use them differently, but they have to access what that means. And so thinking about that, how important it is to pay attention to the abstract things that we see in numerals around us or other things. That's some of the work that we're doing in school so that kids can think greater and greater in terms of abstraction as they head toward middle school and high school math. Okay, so getting them ready for middle school is not just about doing 5th grade math work. It's really about getting them to think abstractly about the math that's around them in the world. Okay, so math, it all adds up. It all adds up. It lines up so well with so many of the other things that we teach here at school every single day, and it's such a big part of our lives. And if we treat it that way, then kids are not going to grow up as math phobic as some of our generation might have, and they'll make it all add up and figure it out. Thank you, and I'll see you next time.